The ballroom shimmered under a cascade of light, the chandelier above fracturing into 1,000 glints that danced across the polished floor. I stood at the edge of it, all my heels digging into the soles of my feet. My breath caught somewhere between resolve and surrender. My parents' gala pulsed with life 300 guests draped in silk and satin, their laughter weaving through the clink of champagne flutes and the murmur of self-assured voices. I didn't belong here. Not in their eyes. "Abigail, please, just don't make a fuss," my mother had said hours earlier, her gaze sliding past me like I was a shadow she'd rather not acknowledge. At 48, I was still the daughter they couldn't place, the one they wished would fade into the background. I smoothed the hem of my navy dress, its plain lines unchanged from every formal event I'd attended for years. It was simple, unassuming, the kind of dress that didn't draw eyes, the kind of dress that matched the woman they saw or didn't see. The invitation had arrived as an afterthought buried in an email about guest parking and dietary restrictions. No seat waited for me at the family table. No card bore my name in elegant script. I'd come anyway, driven by some foolish hope, or perhaps a stubborn refusal to let them erase me entirely. But standing there, pressed against the wall, I felt the old wound reopen. Invisible. Always invisible. The room thrummed with my parents' triumph. My father, a retired banker with a handshake for every man of status, worked the crowd with practiced ease. My mother, resplendent in an emerald gown, soaked in compliments about the gala's perfection, the flowers, the music, the impeccable guest list. My younger sister Claire was the evening's centerpiece. She glided through the throng, her laughter bright and effortless, her tech mogul husband at her side, his smile sharp with pride. "Claire's the one who made it," a woman nearby whispered, her voice thick with admiration. "The Warricks' pride and joy." My fingers tightened around the glass of water I held, the cool surface grounding me. I never drank at these events. I couldn't afford to lose control, not even for a moment. A woman in a glittering dress brushed past her elbow, jostling me. "Oh, my apologies," she said, her eyes already elsewhere, dismissing me before I could respond. I stepped back, my shoulder grazing the heavy velvet curtain behind me. The fabric felt like a shield, a thin barrier between me and the world that refused to see me. Then I heard my father's voice, rich and commanding, rising above the din. To family, he declared, his glass lifted high. To Claire, who's brought us such pride, and to all of you, our cherished friends. The room erupted in applause, a wave of warmth and celebration. I stood still, my heart clenching, waiting for something, anything. But my name didn't follow. Not a syllable. Not a glance. I turned toward the exit. My chest tight, the air too thick to breathe. I could leave. I should leave. The thought pulsed in my mind, steady as a drum. But before I could move, my mother's assistant appeared, a young man with anxious eyes and a clipboard clutched to his chest. "Abigail," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "Your mother asked if you could move to the back. The front tables are needed for the VIPs. I stared at him, the words landing like a slap, though his tone was soft. The back. Of course. I nodded my face, a mask of calm, my hands steady as I set my glass on a passing tray. I'd mastered this long ago, how to bury the hurt, how to let it sink into the marrow where no one could see. I wove through the crowd, my steps silent, unnoticed. Near the service entrance, I found a folding chair tucked behind a towering fern, its fronds casting jagged shadows across the floor. It was a seat for caterers, for staff, not for a daughter. I sat my spine straight, my hands folded in my lap. The gala swirled on without me, a kaleidoscope of speeches, toasts, and laughter. I kept my eyes on the floor, tracing the lines in the marble, counting my breaths. 1, 2, 3. I didn't belong here. I never had. And yet I stayed. Not out of hope had long since worn thin, but out of something else, something forged in years of silence and endurance. something unyielding like the weight of a secret I'd carried too long. I think of that moment now and the ache still lingers. Not for the chair or the fern or the way they pushed me aside, but for the part of me that let them. The part that wondered even for a moment if they were right, if I was nothing. I'd spent years building a life they couldn't imagine, a life bound by oaths and shadows, and yet I stood there letting them write me out of their story. But that night something stirred, something deep and restless like a tide turning beneath a still surface. That night the truth I'd kept locked away began to press against the seams of my silence. I've carried that moment with me, and I carry it still. It's not just a memory, it's a mirror showing me who I was, who I am, and who I've always been. If you're listening, if you've ever felt like you don't exist in someone else's world, I need you to hear this. Stay with me. Click that subscribe button because this story isn't just mine. It's for anyone who's ever been pushed to the edges, told they don't matter, made to feel small. I promise you it's worth hearing. Because what happened next wasn't just a moment. It was the unraveling of everything they thought they knew about me. It was the beginning of something I never saw coming. I sat there behind the fern, the Gala's noise washing over me like a distant tide. My mother's voice floated through the air, thanking the guests for their generosity, their presence, their shared vision of a perfect evening. I closed my eyes, letting the words blur, letting the hurt settle. I'd always been good at this disappearing, even when I was right there. It was a skill I'd learned young, sharpened over years of family dinners, where my voice went unheard of gatherings, where my presence was a courtesy, not a necessity. Claire was the one they celebrated, the one whose achievements filled their conversations. Claire with her perfect life, her perfect husband, her perfect story. And me, I was Abigail, the older sister, the quiet one, the one who'd never amounted to anything, or so they believed. But they didn't know. They couldn't know. The weight of what I'd done, what I'd been, was too heavy to share, too dangerous to speak aloud. I'd made my peace with that long ago, or so I thought. Yet sitting there in that folding chair, I felt the old questions rise. Why did I come? Why did I let myself hope they'd see me? I opened my eyes, my gaze falling on a young waitress balancing a tray of empty glasses. She caught my eye, offered a small, tired smile. I nodded back a silent acknowledgement. We were the same in that moment, unseen, uncounted, moving through a world that didn't pause for us. The Gala stretched on the energy in the room building as the night reached its peak. A string quartet played something soft and mournful, a counterpoint to the chatter. I adjusted my posture, my hands still in my lap, my face composed. I'd leave soon, I told myself. I'd slip out the service entrance, hail a cab, go back to my quiet apartment with its bare walls and locked drawers. But even as I planned my escape, I felt it, that sharp, unnameable thing that had kept me here. It wasn't defiance, not exactly. It was something older, something that had survived every slight, every dismissal. It was the part of me that refused to break. And then, as if the universe had heard my silent resolve, the air in the room shifted. A murmur rippled through the crowd heads, turning toward the main entrance. I didn't look up, not at first. I was used to ignoring the spectacle, used to staying small. But the murmur grew, and with it, a sense of something inevitable, something I couldn't outrun. I lifted my eyes, my heart steady, but quickening. That was when I knew. The night wasn't over, and neither was I. The Gala's hum faded as I sat behind that fern, the folding chair creaking beneath me. My eyes traced the marble floor, but my mind was elsewhere, slipping back to places I'd taught myself to forget. The ballroom's glitter dissolved into the memory of a different kind of light. Harsh fluorescent buzzing in a windowless room where I'd once sat my hands, steady on a dossier, my heart racing. I was 29, then younger, but not softer. My uniform crisp, my gaze unyielding. The room had been filled with men twice my age, their stars and bars gleaming on their shoulders, yet they'd looked to me. Captain Warrick, one had said, his voice low with respect. "We need your call on this." I'd made it. I always did. I blinked and the memory shifted. A desert night, the air thick with dust, my boots silent on the sand. I'd moved through shadows, my team behind me, our mission unspoken even among ourselves. The weight of a satellite phone in my hand, the crackle of a voice on the other end, someone in Washington, someone who needed what only I could deliver. I'd been Abigail Warrick then too, but not the Abigail my family knew, not the quiet daughter, the overlooked sister. I was Director Warrick, codename Sentinel, the one who turned chaos into order, who carried secrets that could topple governments. I'd sworn to bury that life, to let it die with the medals locked in a safe no one would ever see. My fingers brushed the edge of my chair, grounding me back in the ballroom. The Gala churned on, oblivious to the woman in the shadows. I could still feel the desert's heat on my skin, the weight of decisions that had cost lives, some saved, some lost. I'd been gone for years at a time, my absences explained away to my family as consulting work or travel. They'd never asked for details. They'd never cared to. "Abigail's off doing her little thing," my mother would say, her tone light, dismissive. Claire's corporate victories filled their letters, their phone calls, their pride. My silence filled the rest. I shifted in my seat, my posture still rigid, my hands folded. The truth was, I'd chosen that silence. Not because I wanted their indifference, but because I had to. The oath I'd taken at 25 in a room with no windows and no witnesses bound me tighter than any family tie. I couldn't tell them about the nights I'd spent decoding intercepts that saved thousands, or the mornings I'd woken in safe houses, my name a whisper even to myself. I couldn't tell them about the scar on my left shoulder hidden beneath my dress, or the way my hands still knew the weight of a rifle, though I hadn't touched one in a decade. Those truths belonged to a woman they'd never met, a woman I'd buried to keep them safe. But burying her hadn't been enough. Sometimes in the quiet of my apartment, I'd catch myself remembering. The clink of a glass in the ballroom became the clink of a shell casing hitting the ground. The murmur of voices became the hum of a briefing room, the weight of a nation's trust pressing against my spine. I'd been someone once, someone who mattered. And yet here I was, tucked behind a fern, my own mother's assistant, whispering that I should stay out of sight. The irony burned, but I swallowed it like always. I thought of a moment years ago when I'd almost broken my silence. It was Christmas. The family gathered at my parents' estate, snow falling outside. Claire had been holding court, regaling everyone with tales of her latest boardroom triumph. My father had beamed my mother, nodding along their eyes, bright with pride. I'd sat at the edge of the couch, a glass of untouched wine in my hand, listening. Then Claire had turned to me, her smile sharp. "And you, Abigail Still." Consulting. The room had laughed a soft, pitying sound. I'd opened my mouth, the truth clawing at my throat. I wanted to tell them about the medal I'd received in a classified ceremony, about the lives I'd saved, about the nights I'd stared down, fear, and won. But I'd stopped myself. I'd smiled, nodded, said, something like that. The moment passed and they moved on. They always moved on. Now in the ballroom, I felt that same urge rising sharper this time. I pressed my lips together, my fingers tightening in my lap. I wasn't that woman anymore. I'd retired, walked away, chosen this quiet life. But the quiet wasn't peace. It was a cage. I'd let them define me, let their indifference shape the edges of my days. And for what? To sit here hidden while they toasted a life that wasn't mine. I closed my eyes, the Gala's noise fading again. Another memory surfaced unbidden. I was 35, standing in a Pentagon office, my hands clasped behind my back. A general had stood before me, his face lined with years of war. Director Warrick, he'd said, "You've given more than anyone could ask. If you ever need us, we're here." I'd knotted my throat tight, knowing I'd never call. I'd walked away that day, trading my title for anonymity, my purpose for silence. I thought it would be enough. I thought I could live as Abigail, just Abigail, the woman who didn't matter. But sitting here now, I wasn't so sure. The gala's energy shifted, pulling me back. A speaker took the podium, some local dignitary praising my parents' philanthropy. I opened my eyes, my gaze falling on the fern's leaves, their edges curling in the artificial light. I wondered not for the first time what it would feel like to tell them, to stand up, walk to that podium and say, "You don't know me. You never did." But I didn't move. I never moved. The weight of my oath, my secrets held me in place. And yet something in me stirred something that had been quiet too long. I thought of the nights I'd spent alone after missions, after briefings, after losses no one could know. The loneliness had been a companion as familiar as my own shadow. Sometimes I'd look in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. "Who are you, Abigail?" I'd whisper, and the answer would come soft but certain. "You're the one who stays standing." But standing wasn't enough anymore. Not here, not now. I felt it in my bones, a restlessness I couldn't name. The speaker finished, and the crowd applauded. I watched them, their faces bright with admiration, their lives untouched by the shadows I'd carried. I envied them in a way, not their wealth or their ease, but their freedom to be known, to be seen. I'd given that up long ago, and I'd told myself it was worth it. But sitting here in this chair, I wondered, had I traded too much? The question hung there unanswered as the gala rolled on. I glanced at my hands, still folded, still steady. They were the hands of a woman who'd signed orders, who'd held lives in her palm, who'd built a legacy no one in this room could imagine. And yet they were also the hands of a woman who'd let herself be forgotten. I didn't know which Abigail was real anymore. Maybe both, maybe neither. But as I sat there, the fern's shadow falling across my lap, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not pride, but resolve. The kind that had carried me through deserts and briefings and impossible choices. The kind that whispered, "This isn't the end." The ballroom's lights dimmed slightly, signaling a shift in the program. I straightened my heart, steady but quickening. I didn't know what was coming, not yet, but I felt it the way you feel a storm before the first rain falls. Something was about to change, and for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. If you're still with me, if you've ever carried a truth too heavy to share, I need you to keep listening. This story, it's for you too. Hit that subscribe button because what comes next is more than a moment. It's the truth I'd buried rising to meet me at last. The gala's light softened, casting a golden haze over the room. I sat in my folding chair, the fern's shadow still draped across my lap, my hands still folded, my heart still steady. The crowd had settled into their seats, their attention fixed on the podium where my mother now stood, her voice smooth and commanding as she introduced the next speaker. I watched her, the way her emerald gown caught the light, the way her smile held the room captive. She was everything I wasn't visible, celebrated, undeniable. And I was Abigail Warrick, the woman they'd tucked away, the one they'd rather forget. I'd grown used to it, this quiet erasure. It wasn't just tonight, not just this gala. It was years of it, decades. Family dinners where my chair was an afterthought, conversations that skated past me like I was a ghost. Abigail's so independent, my father would say, his tone a mix of pity and dismissal. Independent, a polite way of saying unnecessary. Claire, my sister, was the one they turned to, the one whose name filled their stories. Claire, with her corner office and her magazine covers and her life that sparkled like the chandelier above. I was the older sister, the one who'd never married, never shown, never given them anything to brag about. Or so they thought. I shifted in my seat, the chair's metal frame pressing into my back. The speaker at the podium, a city councilman I think, droned on about community and legacy. I didn't listen. My eyes drifted to the crowd, to the faces I'd known for years. Neighbors, family, friends, my parents' colleagues. They'd all made their assumptions about me. Spinster I'd overheard once at a cousin's wedding. Such a shame, another had whispered at a charity luncheon. Abigail could have been something if she'd tried. I'd smiled through it, all my lips tight, my heart a stone. I'd learned to let their words pass through me, to let them think what they wanted. It was easier that way, safer, but it wasn't painless. Every slight, every dismissal left a mark, like a bruise you don't notice until you press it. I'd spent years telling myself it didn't matter. I'd had a life they couldn't imagine, a life of covert operations, of decisions that shaped nations, of sacrifices that left scars both seen and unseen. I'd been Director Warrick, the woman who walked into rooms and changed them, the woman whose name carried weight in places no one here would ever know. But that was another life, another Abigail. The one sitting here in this navy dress was just me. And sometimes, in the quiet of nights like this, I wondered if I'd lost her for good. I caught a glimpse of Claire across the room, her head thrown back in laughter, her hand resting on her husband's arm. She was surrounded, as always, by people drawn to her light. A young woman in a sleek red dress leaned in her voice, carrying just enough for me to hear. "Claire, you're an inspiration," she said, her eyes wide with admiration. "How do you do it all?" Claire smiled her answer, lost in the crowd's murmur, but I didn't need to hear it. I knew her story by heart, the one she told the one they loved. I didn't begrudge her success. I never had, but I envied the ease of it, the way her life was allowed to be loud, to be seen. No one approached me. No one asked my story. I was the woman in the back, the one who didn't matter. But I wasn't bitter, not exactly. I'd made my choices. I'd chosen secrecy duty, the kind of life that demanded silence. And yet sitting here, I felt the weight of it heavier than ever. The weight of being unknown, not just to them, but to myself. Who was I really? The director who'd stared down crises without flinching, or the woman who let her family push her into the shadows I didn't know anymore? I thought of a moment months ago at a family barbecue. My father had been holding court, regaling everyone with Claire's latest triumph, a merger, a headline, something shiny. I'd been there flipping burgers at the grill, my hair pulled back, my sleeves rolled up. A cousin had wandered over, beer in hand, and said, "You're so good at this, Abigail, always helping out." I'd nodded, my smile automatic. But later, when the house was quiet, I'd stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes, and felt the tears come. Not for the cousin's words, but for the truth behind them. I was the helper, the one who stayed in the background, the one who didn't ask for more. And I hated it. I hated that I'd let it become true. Now in the ballroom, I felt that same ache, sharper, deeper. I looked down at my hands, still folded, still steady. They were the hands that had signed orders, that had held encrypted files, that had shaken the hands of generals and ambassadors. They were the hands of a woman who'd built something extraordinary, something no one here could comprehend. And yet they were also the hands of a woman who'd sat through countless evenings like this, silent, unseen. I wanted to stand, to walk out, to leave this place and never look back. But I didn't. I stayed because staying was what I did. It was what I'd always done. I noticed a young girl, maybe 10, weaving through the crowd with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. She moved carefully, her face serious, her eyes scanning the room for empty hands. She reminded me of myself at that age, quiet, watchful, trying so hard to be useful. I caught her eye, offered a small smile. She hesitated, then smiled back a quick, shy thing before she moved on. That smile stayed with me, a flicker of warmth in the cold of the night. It reminded me that I wasn't invisible, not entirely, not to everyone. The councilman finished his speech, and the crowd clapped politely. My mother returned to the podium, her voice bright as she announced a brief intermission. People rose, stretching, mingling their voices, swelling again. I stayed where I was, my chair, a small island in the sea of movement. A woman nearby, someone I vaguely recognized from my parents' social circle, caught sight of me. "Abigail, is that you?" she said, her tone dripping with surprise as if I'd appeared out of thin air. "You're so quiet back here. Don't you want to join us?" I smiled, my voice soft but steady. "I'm fine, thank you." She nodded, already turning away, her interest gone as quickly as it had come. I watched her go, my heart a quiet drum. Fine. I was always fine. It was my armor, my shield, the word that kept the world at bay. But beneath it, I wasn't fine. I was tired. Tired of pretending, tired of hiding, tired of carrying a past that no one cared to know. I thought of the safe in my apartment, the one with the medals, the citations, the letters from men and women whose names would never be spoken aloud. I thought of the nights I'd spent staring at them, wondering if they were enough. If I was enough. The intermission stretched on the room, alive with chatter and laughter. I saw my father across the way, his arm around Claire, his face glowing with pride. I saw my mother surrounded by admirers, her laughter bright. I saw the life they'd built, the one I'd never fit into. And for the first time, I let myself feel it, not just the hurt, but the anger. It was small, a spark, but it was there. I'd given everything to a world they'd never understand, and they'd given me this, a folding chair, a fern, a whispered request to stay out of sight. I deserved more. I always had. The lights flickered, signaling the end of the intermission. The crowd began to settle, their voices softening. I straightened in my chair, my hands still, my eyes clear. Something was shifting inside me, something I couldn't name, but could feel like the first tremor of an earthquake. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew I was ready. Ready to be seen. Ready to be heard. Ready to be Abigail Warrick, whoever she was. The gala's lights brightened, pulling the room back into focus. The crowd settled, their chatter fading as my mother returned to the podium, her smile as polished as the crystal flutes on the tables. I sat in my folding chair, the fern's shadow still cloaking me. My hand still folded, my heart a quiet pulse. The air felt heavier now, charged with the weight of the evening's crescendo. This was no ordinary gala, I realized. My parents had outdone themselves. Senators, CEOs, even a retired general mingled among the guests, their presence lending the night an unspoken gravitas. I'd almost stayed home, almost let the ache of their indifference win. But I was here out of politeness, out of habit, out of some stubborn thread of loyalty I couldn't cut. I smoothed my navy dress, its plain fabric a stark contrast to the sequins and silk around me. I'd chosen it deliberately, as always unremarkable, unassuming, a shield against eyes that never lingered long. The invitation had come with a note, formal attire, family presence requested. Family. The word had stung, a reminder of the role I played in their story. Peripheral, optional, a name on a list, but not in their hearts. I debated not coming, standing in my apartment with the invitation in hand, the safe in the corner, whispering memories of who I'd been. But I'd pulled the dress from my closet, slipped on my low heels, and driven here, telling myself it was just one night. One more night of being Abigail, the daughter they didn't see. The ballroom was a spectacle, white roses cascading from centerpieces, a string quartet weaving a soft melody, waitstaff gliding through the crowd with practiced grace. My parents had spared no expense, their legacy on display for all to admire. I watched them from my corner, my father's broad shoulders squared as he greeted a congressman, my mother's laughter bright as she charmed a philanthropist. Claire, of course, was the evening's jewel, her red gown catching every light. Her husband at her side, their power couple. Aura, undeniable. I saw the way people gravitated to her, their smiles eager, their words laced with awe. Claire Warrick. I heard someone say, She's going places. I pressed my lips together, my fingers tightening in my lap. I didn't resent her. I couldn't. But the contrast, the way they celebrated her while I sat here hidden, cut deeper than I wanted to admit. I'd nearly walked out during the intermission. The thought had come sharp and clear as I watched the crowd mingle their voices, a wall I couldn't breach. I could slip through the service entrance, disappear into the night, let them forget me entirely. But something held me back. Not hope I'd learned long ago to stop hoping for their approval. It was something else, something forged in the years I'd spent carrying secrets heavier than their indifference. I stayed my posture straight, my eyes fixed on the podium, waiting for a reason I couldn't name. My mother's voice cut through my thoughts, smooth and commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "we're honored to share this evening with so many distinguished guests. Tonight is about legacy, our families, our communities, and our shared commitment to a brighter future." The crowd applauded their enthusiasm, warm, genuine. I watched her, the way she held their attention, the way she made the room feel like it belonged to her. I wondered not for the first time what it would be like to stand in her place, to be seen, to be known. But I pushed the thought away. That wasn't my life. It never had been. She introduced the keynote speaker, a retired general whose name sent a ripple through the room. I knew him not personally, but by reputation. General Harlan Voss, a legend in military circles, a man whose decisions had shaped conflicts I'd once navigated in the shadows. I straightened slightly, my breath catching. I hadn't expected someone like him here, someone whose world had once intersected with mine. He took the podium, his presence commanding, his silver hair catching the light. "Thank you, Margaret," he said, nodding to my mother. "It's an honor to be here among such remarkable company." His voice was gravelly, steady, the kind that carried weight without effort. I leaned forward just an inch, my hand still in my lap. He spoke of service, of sacrifice, of the unseen work that holds a nation together. I listened, my heart quickening, each word a thread pulling me back to a life I'd buried. I saw myself at 32 in a briefing room, my voice steady as I outlined a strategy that saved a city. I saw myself at 35 in a safe house, my hands shaking as I decoded a message that stopped a war. I saw myself at 40 standing before a panel of generals, my title, Director Warrick, spoken with reverence. Those moments were gone, locked away, but they lived in me still, in the set of my shoulders, in the way my eyes never wavered. The crowd applauded as Voss paused, their faces rapt. I glanced around, catching snippets of their reactions, admiration, pride, a few whispered comments about his storied career. No one looked at me. No one knew that I'd once walked in that world, that I'd carried burdens as heavy as his. I was just Abigail, the woman in the back, the one they'd asked to stay out of sight. The irony twisted in my chest, but I kept my face calm, my hands still. I'd learned long ago to hide the truth, to let it simmer beneath the surface. But tonight it felt closer, sharper, like a blade pressing against my skin. Voss continued his words, turning to the present, to the need for leadership, for courage, for those who step up when no one else will. I felt a pang, a memory of who I'd been. Sentinel, the code name they'd given me, the woman who'd never flinched. I wanted to stand, to walk out, to escape the weight of it all. But I stayed my chair, creaking, the fern's leaves brushing my shoulder. I stayed because I always stayed, because I'd learned to endure, to wait, to carry the silence until it broke. Then it happened. A murmur at the back of the room, a shift in the air. Heads turned, whispers spreading like a current. I didn't look, not at first. I kept my eyes on Voss, on the way his hands gripped the podium, steady and sure. But the murmur grew, and with it a sense of something inevitable. I lifted my gaze. My heart, a quiet drum. A man in a suit, flanked by two others, moved through the crowd, their steps purposeful. They weren't guests. I knew that immediately, the way they scanned the room, the way their presence cut through the gala's warmth. My breath caught a flicker of recognition I couldn't place. The man in the lead stopped, his eyes sweeping the room. He was older, his face lined but sharp, his suit impeccable. I knew him. Not by name, not yet, but by the way he carried himself, someone from my world, someone who'd walked the same halls, signed the same oaths. My hands tightened in my lap, my pulse quickening. He spoke to a waiter, his voice low, urgent. The waiter pointed, and the man's gaze followed toward the back, toward the fern, toward me. I froze, my heart a stone. No, it couldn't be. I was Abigail now, just Abigail, the woman who didn't matter. But the man's eyes locked on mine, and in that moment I felt it, the past, rushing forward, unstoppable. He started toward me, the crowd parting their whispers, growing louder. I wanted to stand, to run, to disappear, but I didn't. I sat, my spine straight, my hands steady, the way I'd sat in briefing rooms, in safe houses, in moments when the world hung in the balance. He stopped a few feet away, his face unreadable. "Ms. Warrick." He said, his voice low but clear, cutting through the room's hum. I nodded, my throat tight, my eyes never leaving his. The crowd was watching now, their curiosity a weight I could feel. My mother's voice faltered at the podium, her smile flickering. Claire turned her red gown a flash of color, her expression confused. My father's head lifted, his eyes narrowing. I felt their stares, all of them, but I didn't look away from the man before me. "We've been looking for you," he said, and the words landed like a thunderclap, though his tone was calm. I opened my mouth, but no sound came. The room seemed to hold its breath, the Gala's glitter fading, the fern's shadow no longer a shield. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew it was here. The truth I'd buried, the life I'd left behind it, was rising, and there was no stopping it now. The man's words hung in the air, sharp and undeniable. "We've been looking for you." My heart thudded a slow, heavy beat as the ballroom's glitter seemed to dim the crowd's murmurs, fading into a distant hum. I sat frozen in my folding chair, the fern's shadow no longer a refuge, my hands still clasped in my lap. His eyes held mine steady, knowing the eyes of someone who'd walked the same shadowed paths I had. I knew him now, or at least his kind. He was no ordinary guest. The suit, the posture, the quiet authority, he was from my world, the one I'd buried a decade ago. I nodded, a small, instinctive motion, my throat too tight to speak. The room was watching, their curiosity a palpable weight. My mother's voice had stopped mid-sentence at the podium, her smile frozen, her eyes darting toward me. Claire turned fully now, her red gown catching the light, her brow furrowed in confusion. My father's head tilted, his expression caught between irritation and bewilderment. I felt their stares, the collective gaze of 300 guests, but I didn't look away from the man before me. He was the only thing that mattered. He stepped closer, his two escorts flanking him, their presence a silent barrier between us and the crowd. "Ms. Warrick," he said again, his voice low but carrying, "I'm Colonel Daniel Pierce, office of the Vice President." The title landed like a stone in the room, ripples of whispers spreading outward. I blinked, my mind racing to place him. Pierce. I'd heard the name maybe in a briefing years ago, maybe in a classified memo, but it wasn't his name that shook me. It was what he represented. The Vice President. My past was here in this ballroom, and it wasn't letting me go. I opened my mouth, my voice barely a whisper. "Colonel, I'm retired." It was all I could manage, a reflex, a shield. I'd left that life behind, locked it away with the medals and the oaths. But Pierce's expression didn't waver. He leaned in slightly, his tone firm but respectful. "With all due respect, ma'am, you're needed now." Needed. The word hit me like a current, pulling me back to briefing rooms, to nights when my decisions shaped the world. I shook my head, a small, almost imperceptible motion. "There's been a mistake," I said, my voice steadier now, though my heart wasn't. "I'm not that person anymore." He didn't argue. Instead, he straightened his eyes, never leaving mine. "The Vice President disagrees," he said simply, and the room seemed to tilt. The vice president. I felt the weight of every choice I'd made, every secret I'd carried, pressing against my ribs. I wanted to stand, to run, to disappear into the night like I'd planned, but I couldn't. Not now. Not with Pierce standing there, not with the crowd watching, not with my family's eyes boring into me. Their confusion, a silent question I couldn't answer. I glanced at the fern, its leaves trembling slightly in the air-conditioned breeze. It was absurd how small it seemed now, how fragile. I'd hidden behind it all night, letting it shield me from their indifference, but there was no hiding anymore. Pierce gestured toward the center of the room, a subtle but unmistakable invitation. "Ma'am, if you'll come with me," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I looked at him, at the lines etched into his face, at the weight he carried in his shoulders. He wasn't here by choice, I realized. He was here by duty, and so was I. I stood, my movement slow, deliberate, the way I'd moved in moments of crisis years ago. My navy dress felt too thin, too ordinary, but I squared my shoulders, my spine straight, my hands steady at my sides. The crowd's whispers grew louder, a wave of curiosity and disbelief. I felt Claire's stare sharp and searching, her perfect world disrupted. I felt my mother's unease, her composure cracking at the podium. I felt my father's frown, his need to control the narrative slipping. But I didn't look at them. I looked at Pierce, at the path he was asking me to walk. He led the way, his escorts falling into step behind us. I followed my heels, clicking softly on the marble floor, each step a reclamation of something I'd lost. The crowd parted their faces, a blur of shock and fascination. I heard fragments of their whispers. "Who is she, Warrick?" "The sister." "What's happening?" But I kept my eyes forward. My expression calmed my heart, a storm. Pierce stopped near the front of the room where a small group of men and women in suits had gathered, their faces serious, their presence out of place in the gala's opulence. I recognized the type security intelligence, the kind of people who moved in silence and shadows. One of them, a woman with sharp eyes and a clipped nod, stepped forward. "Director Warrick," she said, her voice low, respectful. "Director." The title sliced through me, a blade I hadn't felt in years. I flinched, a small, involuntary motion, but I didn't correct her. I couldn't. Not here, not now. She gestured toward a side door, discreet but guarded. "The vice president is waiting," she said. I stared at her, my mind reeling, waiting. For me. After all these years, after all I'd given up, they were calling me back. I turned slightly and my eyes catching my family's for the first time. Claire stood frozen, her red gown a stark contrast to her pale face, her mouth half open as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. My mother had stepped down from the podium, her hands clasped tightly, her smile gone. My father was on his feet, his jaw set, his eyes narrowed, as if he could will this moment away. I saw the questions in their faces, the disbelief, the dawning realization that I was someone they didn't know. I wanted to say something, to explain, to make them understand, but I didn't. I'd spent too long explaining myself to a world that didn't listen. Pierce touched my arm lightly, a gesture of reassurance, not urgency. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "we don't have much time." I nodded, my throat burning, my resolve hardening. I turned away from my family, from the crowd, from the fern and the folding chair, and the life I'd let them define. I followed Pierce toward the side door, the weight of their stares heavy on my back. The room was silent now. The music stopped, the gala's rhythm broken. I felt it, the shift, the turning of a tide I hadn't seen coming. As we reached the door, I heard my mother's voice, faint, almost desperate. "Abigail." It was the first time she'd said my name all night, and it broke something in me, a small, fragile thing I'd carried too long. I didn't turn back. I couldn't. Not yet. The woman with the sharp eyes opened the door, and I stepped through, the ballroom's light fading behind me. The hallway beyond was stark fluorescent, a world I knew too well. Pierce walked beside me, his silence a comfort, his presence a reminder of who I'd been. I didn't know what the vice president wanted or why they'd come for me now after all these years, but I felt it deep in my bones, the call of duty, the pull of a life I'd never fully left behind. I was Abigail Warrick, Director Sentinel, the woman who'd faced impossible choices and won. And for the first time in a decade, I felt like her again. The hallway was stark, its fluorescent lights casting a cold glow on the tiled floor. My heels echoed with each step, a steady rhythm that matched the thud of my heart. Colonel Pierce walked beside me, his silence an anchor, his presence a bridge to a world I'd thought I'd left behind. The woman with the sharp eyes led the way, her stride brisk, her posture all business. Behind us, the ballroom's muffled noise faded, the gala's glitter replaced by the utilitarian reality of this corridor, a reality I knew too well. I was Abigail Warrick, and I was walking back into the shadows I'd sworn to escape. We stopped at a plain door, unmarked, guarded by a man in a suit who nodded at the woman and stepped aside. She turned to me, her expression softening, just enough to hint at respect. "Director Warrick," she said again, the title. A weight I couldn't shake. "The vice president is inside. He asked for you specifically." I stared at her, my breath catching. Specifically. The word was a key unlocking memories I'd buried, briefings, missions, moments when my name carried power. I nodded, my hands steady at my sides, though inside I was reeling. I didn't know why I was here, but I knew it wasn't a mistake. The door opened and I stepped into a small, dimly lit room. A conference table dominated the space, surrounded by a handful of people, men and women in suits, their faces taut with urgency. At the far end stood Vice President Edward Langston, his presence unmistakable even in the low light. I'd seen him on screens and briefings, but never like this real human. His tie loosened, his eyes sharp with focus. He looked up as I entered, and the room seemed to pause, every gaze turning to me. I felt the weight of it, the expectation, the recognition. I stood taller, my navy dress suddenly feeling like a uniform. Director Abigail Warrick Langston said, his voice clear, reverent, cutting through the room like a blade. The title hit me harder than I expected, a flood of memories rushing forward, desert safe houses, decisions that changed the world. I opened my mouth to protest, to say I was retired, but he raised a hand, silencing me with a look that was both kind and commanding. "Sentinel," he added, using my code name, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Sentinel. The name I'd carried in the darkest moments, the name no one in that ballroom knew. I felt it settle over me, heavy but right like a mantle I'd never truly set down. I stood frozen, my heart a storm, as Langston stepped forward. "We've been searching for you," he said, his tone softer now, almost apologetic. "I know you've stepped away, but we need you. Now." I stared at him, my mind racing to catch up. Need me. After 10 years of silence, of folding chairs and ferns, they needed me. I wanted to ask why, to demand answers, but my training kicked in. Calm, assess, respond. I nodded, my voice low but steady. "What's the situation, sir?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured to a chair at the table, a seat of equal standing among the others. I hesitated, then sat, my posture rigid, my hands folded. The woman with the sharp eyes took a seat across from me, sliding a tablet my way. "Classified," she said simply, her finger tapping the screen to unlock it. I glanced at the display maps, timelines, redacted names. A crisis unfolding in real time, the kind I'd handled a dozen times before. My eyes scanned the data, my mind slipping into the rhythm I'd never forgotten. Analyze, strategize, decide. Langston spoke, his voice low, urgent. "We're facing a threat we can't neutralize without your expertise. The operation you ran in '09, the one that stopped the Damascus breach. That's what we need now." Damascus. The word was a punch pulling me back to a night of sand and sweat, of a choice that saved thousands but cost me pieces I'd never recover. I looked at him, my face calm, my heart racing. "That was a long time ago," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine. "Not to us, not to those who know what you did." I felt the room's attention, the weight of their trust, their need. I was Director Warrick again. Sentinel, the woman who didn't flinch. But I was also Abigail, the woman who'd sat behind a fern, who'd let her family erase her. The two collided, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then I nodded, my resolve hardening. "Tell me what you need," I said, and the words were a vow, a reclaiming of who I'd been. But before Langston could respond, the door behind us opened. I turned, my heart lurching, as my mother stepped into the room, her emerald gown out of place in this stark space. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes wide with something I'd never seen in her uncertainty. "Abigail," she said, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" The crowd from the ballroom hovered behind her, their faces a blur of shock and curiosity. Claire was there, her red gown vivid, her expression a mix of confusion and something sharper, jealousy maybe, or fear. My father stood at the edge, his jaw tight, his control slipping. I stood, my hands steady, my eyes meeting my mother's. I saw the questions in her face, the disbelief, the dawning realization that I was someone she didn't know. Langston stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Mrs. Warrick," he said, addressing my mother, "your daughter is a national asset. Director Abigail Warrick. Codename Sentinel has served this country in ways you can't imagine." The words landed like thunder. The room silent, the crowd beyond the door frozen. I saw Claire's mouth drop open. My father's eyes widen, my mother's hands tremble. They didn't know. They'd never known. I wanted to speak, to explain, but Langston continued, his voice carrying the weight of truth. Her work in Damascus saved countless lives. Her leadership in covert operations set a standard few can match. And tonight, we need her again. He turned to me, his eyes softening. "Director, we're honored to have you back." The room seemed to shrink, the world narrowing to this moment, to the truth I'd hidden for so long. I felt their stares, my family, the guests, the people who dismissed me, and I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, not vengeance, but clarity. I was Abigail Warrick, and I was enough. I turned to my mother, my voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you," I said, and the words were true, though they carried no regret. I'd kept my silence to protect them, to protect myself. But the silence was over now. I looked at Claire, at my father, at the crowd beyond, and I saw it, the shock, the regret, the reverence. They saw me finally, but it was too late to matter. I'd needed their faith when I was invisible, not now when the truth was undeniable. Langston touched my arm, a gesture of solidarity. "We need to move," he said, his voice low. I nodded, my heart steady, my purpose clear. I was Director Warrick Sentinel, and I had work to do. But before I followed him, I let myself look back one last time at the fern, the folding chair, the life I'd let them define. It was gone now, replaced by the woman I'd always been. If you're still with me, if you've ever hidden your truth only to have it break free, I need you to stay. Hit that subscribe button, because this story is for you. It's for everyone who's ever been unseen, only to find their moment of reckoning. What happens next, it's not just my story. It's the power of a truth finally spoken. The room felt smaller now, the air thick with the weight of revelation. I stood beside Vice President Langston, my Navy dress no longer a shield but a testament to the life I'd chosen, quiet, unassuming, yet unyielding. The door to the hallway remained open, the ballroom's golden lights spilling in, framing the faces of my family and the gala's guests. They stood frozen, a sea of shock and disbelief, their whispers silenced by the truth Langston had laid bare. Director Abigail Warrick, Sentinel. The words hung in the air, heavier than the chandelier's glitter, sharper than the indifference I'd endured all night. My mother's hands trembled, her emerald gown catching the light as she took a hesitant step forward. "Abigail," she said again, her voice cracking a plea wrapped in confusion. I met her eyes, and for the first time I saw her not as the untouchable matriarch, but as a woman grasping for something she'd lost. Claire stood behind her, her red gown stark against her pale face, her lips parted as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. My father was there too, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between me and Langston, searching for control in a moment that had none. I felt their stares, but they didn't pierce me anymore. I was beyond that now. Langston's hand rested lightly on my arm, a steadying presence. "Director Warrick," he said, his voice low but clear, "we need to brief you fully. Time is critical." I nodded my resolve, a quiet fire, but my eyes lingered on my family. The crowd behind them began to shift, their shock giving way to something else, reverence, curiosity, regret. I saw it in the way heads bowed slightly, in the way hands clasped nervously, in the way eyes met mine and didn't look away. They saw me now, but it wasn't their gaze I'd wanted. Not like this. Colonel Pierce stepped forward, his face unreadable, but his posture respectful. He held a small velvet box, the kind that carried weight beyond its size. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, "this was meant for you years ago. We never had the chance to present it." He opened the box, revealing a metal silver understated its inscription, too small to read from where I stood. But I knew what it was. I'd seen others like it locked away in my safe, their significance known only to those who understood sacrifice, the Distinguished Intelligence Medal. My breath caught a flicker of the past rising Damascus, the night I'd made the call that saved a city, the night I'd lost a piece of myself. Pierce stepped closer, his eyes meeting mine. "For your service," he said simply, and he pinned the medal to my dress just above my heart. The room was silent, the weight of the gesture rippling outward. I felt the cool metal against my chest, the slight tug of the fabric, and I stood taller, my hands steady my heart, a quiet storm. The crowd beyond the door stirred, a soft gasp, breaking the silence. I saw a woman in the back wipe her eyes, a man nod solemnly their respect, a tangible thing. But it was my family's reaction that cut deepest. Claire took a step forward, her hands clasped tightly, her voice barely a whisper. "Abigail." Why didn't you tell us? There was no accusation in her tone, only a raw, searching need to understand. I looked at her. My sister, the golden child who'd never had to fight to be seen. I wanted to answer, to explain the oaths, the secrets, the weight of a life she'd never know. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I offered a small, sad smile, the kind that said more than I ever could. She flinched, her eyes dropping, and I saw it regret, sharp and real. My mother moved next, her steps unsteady, her composure shattered. "We didn't know," she said, her voice breaking. We thought you were..." She trailed off, unable to finish, but I knew what she meant. Nothing. They'd thought I was nothing. I felt the old hurt rise, but it was softer now, muted by the truth that stood between us. I know I said, my voice low, steady, "I didn't want you to know. It was the truth, and it hung there heavy and final. I'd protected them from my world, from its dangers, its costs. But in doing so, I'd let them erase me." My father stayed back, his silence louder than words. I met his eyes, and for the first time I saw something break in him. Pride maybe, or the illusion of control. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his hands clenching at his sides. I didn't need his words. His regret was written in the lines of his face, in the way he couldn't look away. I turned from him, from all of them, my gaze settling on Langston. He nodded a silent acknowledgement of what this moment cost me. The woman with the sharp eyes stepped forward, her tablet in hand. "Director, we need to move," she said, her tone urgent but respectful. I nodded, my purpose clear, but before I followed, I let myself feel it. The shift in the room, the reverence that had replaced indifference. The guests began to rise, some standing, others bowing their heads, a quiet salute to the woman they hadn't known. I saw General Voss, the keynote speaker, among them, his eyes meeting mine with a nod of recognition. He knew. He'd always known. A young man in the crowd, someone I didn't recognize, stepped forward, his face earnest. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice trembling, "for what you did." I blinked, caught off guard, and knotted my throat tight. Others murmured agreement, their voices a soft chorus of respect. I didn't want their thanks, not really, but it settled over me a warmth I hadn't expected. I'd carried my service in silence for so long, and now in this moment it was seen. Langston gestured toward the door, and I moved to follow, but Claire's voice stopped me. "Abigail, wait," she said, her tone desperate now. She crossed the room, her heels clicking, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her hands reaching for mine. I didn't know. I should have known. I looked at her, at the sister I'd loved but never truly known, and I squeezed her hands gently. "It's okay," I said, and I meant it. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I didn't need her apology anymore. I'd found something stronger myself. I stepped back, my hands falling to my sides, the metal a quiet weight against my chest. Langston led the way, Pierce and the woman flanking us, the room's reverence, following me like a shadow. As we reached the door, I heard my mother's voice, soft, almost lost. "We're proud of you, Abigail." I paused, my back to her, my heart a tangle of grief and grace. I didn't turn, but I nodded a small gesture that said enough. I walked through the door, the hallway's stark light welcoming me back to the world I knew. The Gala faded behind me, its glitter irrelevant now. I was Director Warrick's sentinel, and I had work to do. But as I walked, I felt it, the peace of being seen, not for their sake, but for mine. I'd carried my truth in silence, and now it was free. And so was I. The hallway stretched before me, its fluorescent glow a stark contrast to the ballroom's golden warmth. My heels clicked softly on the tile, each step a quiet echo of the life I was stepping back into. Colonel Pierce walked at my side, his silence steady, while the woman with the sharp eyes moved ahead, her tablet glowing with the urgency of the crisis we were about to face. Vice President Langston was already in another room preparing for the briefing, his trust in me a weight I carried with both pride and resolve. The medal pinned to my navy dress pressed against my chest, a small, cool reminder of who I'd been and who I was now. I was Director Abigail Warrick Sentinel, and for the first time in a decade, I felt whole. The door to the ballroom had closed behind us, muffling the Gala's murmurs, but I could still feel the weight of their stares, my family, the guests, the world that had finally seen me, my mother's trembling voice, Claire's tearful apology, my father's silent regret. They lingered in my mind, but they didn't pull me back. I'd spent years longing for their recognition, their pride, but standing here now, I realized I didn't need it. Not anymore. The truth had set me free, not because they'd heard it, but because I'd finally claimed it for myself. We reached a secure room, its heavy door guarded by 2 agents who nodded as we approached. Inside, the air was charged, the hum of urgency palpable. A long table held laptops, maps, and encrypted phones, a scene I'd lived 100 times before. Langston stood at the head, his face lined with focus, his eyes meeting mine with a nod of respect. I took my place at the table, my posture straight, my hands steady the rhythm of my past, slipping into place like a key in a lock. The woman handed me a dossier, her voice brisk but deferential. "Director, this is the latest intel. We need your assessment." I opened the file, my eyes scanning the pages, my mind already at work. This was my world, and I was home. But even as I dove into the briefing, a part of me lingered on the night's events. I thought of the fern, the folding chair, the way I'd let myself be hidden. I thought of the years I'd spent in silence, carrying my service like a secret shame, letting my family's indifference define me. I'd been Abigail, the overlooked daughter, the spinster, the nobody. But I'd also been Sentinel, the woman who'd saved lives, who'd shaped history, who'd never flinched. Those two lives had warred within me, but now they were one. I was Abigail Warrick, and I was enough. The briefing stretched into the early hours, my voice steady as I outlined strategies, my mind sharp despite the years away. Langston listened, his nods affirming my place at the table. Pierce offered insights, his respect unspoken but clear. The woman with the sharp eyes took notes, her efficiency a mirror of my own. We were a team bound by duty, by the unspoken understanding of what it meant to serve. And yet as the hours passed, I felt a quiet shift within me, not just purpose, but peace. I'd answered the call not because I had to, but because I chose to. That choice was my power. When the briefing ended, the crisis contained for now, Langston approached me. "Director," he said, his voice low, "thank you. We couldn't have done this without you." I nodded, my throat tight, the weight of his words settling over me. "It's an honor, sir," I said, and I meant it. He offered a small smile, then turned to the others, leaving me to gather my thoughts. I stood the metal, catching the light, and I felt it, the closure of a chapter I hadn't realized was still open. I left the secure room, Pierce escorting me back to the hallway. The gala was over the ballroom, empty, its chandeliers dimmed. I paused at the service entrance, the folding chair still there, the fern's leaves curling in the quiet. I walked over my fingers, brushing the chair's metal frame, a silent farewell to the woman I'd been. I didn't need to hide anymore. I didn't need to prove myself. I was Abigail Warrick, and that was enough. Outside, the night was cool, the city's hum a distant comfort. Pierce offered to arrange a car, but I shook my head. "I'll walk," I said, my voice soft but certain. He nodded, understanding, and handed me a card with his number. "If you ever need us," he said, echoing words I'd heard years ago. I took it, my smile small but genuine. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it for more than the card. I walked home, my heels steady on the pavement, the metal still pinned to my dress. The streets were quiet, the stars faint above the city's glow. I thought of my family, of the apologies they'd offered, the pride they'd finally shown. I'd call them tomorrow, maybe, or the day after. I'd listen to their questions, their regrets, but I wouldn't explain myself. I didn't need to. My past lived in my spine, in the way I carried myself, in the choices I'd made. They could know me now, but they didn't define me. When I reached my apartment, I unlocked the door, the familiar silence welcoming me. I slipped off my heels, my dress, and carefully unpinned the metal, placing it in the safe with the others. I didn't need to look at them to know they were there, each one. A story, a sacrifice, a piece of who I was. I closed the safe, the click, a quiet promise. I'd answered the call tonight, but I didn't need to live in that world anymore. I could be Abigail, just Abigail, and it was enough. I stood at my window, the city stretching before me, its lights a map of lives I'd helped protect. I thought of the girl with the tray of hors d'oeuvres, the one who'd smiled at me in the ballroom. I thought of the young man who'd thanked me, of the woman who'd wiped her eyes. I thought of everyone who'd ever felt invisible, who'd carried a truth no one saw. And I spoke to them now, to you, my voice steady in the quiet of my apartment. You don't need to explain your past to anyone. I said my words a whisper to the night, to the camera I imagined before me. It lives in your spine, in the way you stand, in the choices you make when no one's watching. You are enough just as you are. And when the world finally sees you, it's not their validation that matters. It's the truth you've always known. I turned from the window, my heart light, my steps sure. I folded the navy dress, tucking it into the closet, a relic of a night that had changed everything. I didn't need it anymore, just as I didn't need the fern, the folding chair, or the silence I'd carried. I walked to the door, my head high, my soul at peace. I stepped into the rest of my life not as Director Warrick, not as Sentinel, but as Abigail, whole, seen, and free. If you're still with me, if you've ever found your truth and let it set you free, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because it's not just my story, it's ours. It's for everyone who's ever been overlooked only to find their moment of grace. Thank you for listening. Now go be who you are. You